In 1984, John McEnroe set a statistical record that the entire tennis world agreed would never, ever be touched. 82 wins, 3 losses, a 96.47% win rate. It was a monument. But after what Jannik Sinner just did in Rome, that impossible ceiling isn't just cracking. It is collapsing. I have watched tennis for a long time. And this whole situation, man, it has been eating at me. Because every channel is talking about his baseline power. Every pundit is analyzing his racket head speed. But nobody is talking about the real reason why this current run is genuinely terrifying. Stay with me. Let us take a step back and look at the actual data from this past Sunday in Italy. The final of the Rome Masters. Jannik Sinner standing across the net from Casper Ruud. The final score was 6-4. 6-4. 2 straightforward sets. A trophy lifted in front of a home crowd. If you just read the result in a newspaper, it looks like a standard, high-level victory for the world's top player. But the scoreline, as it so often does, completely fails to communicate the actual texture of what transpired on that court. Casper Ruud is not a tourist on clay courts. He is a structural problem for almost everyone on the ATP Tour. But watching that final, you did not get the sense that you were watching a contest between two athletes. You got the sense that you were watching an algorithm process a piece of data. Sinner did not need to play out of his mind. He did not need to rely on the fiery energy of the crowd in Rome. He just executed a baseline pattern that systematically suffocated the oxygen out of the stadium. It was quiet. It was inevitable. Now, think about that for a second. Right? When a player reaches this level of absolute dominance, we expect noise. We expect fireworks. When we think of the great runs in tennis history, we think of overwhelming emotion. But Jannik Sinner is doing this in absolute silence. And this brings us back to the United States in 1984. John McEnroe built his 82-3 record on fire, on aggression, on an unpredictable emotional volatility that overwhelmed his opponents. McEnroe was a storm. Sinner is a winter freeze. Winning a Masters event in Rome, for a player from Italy, is supposed to be the emotional climax of a season. It is supposed to involve tears, collapsing on the dirt, a profound release of national pressure. But when the final ball sailed long from Ruud's racket to seal the 6-4 victory, look at the reaction. A calm wave, a polite smile. The weight of an entire nation's expectation was placed squarely on his shoulders, and he treated it like a Tuesday morning practice session. That is not just focus. That is a structural detachment from the stakes of the moment. The common reading of this situation is that Jannik Sinner is simply playing the best tennis of his career, that he has found a purple patch of form on the clay. That is not wrong, it is just incomplete. What is actually happening is a methodical assault on history. This is the 1984 ceiling. For over 4 decades, men's tennis has operated under the assumption that an 8-2-win season with only 3 losses was an anomaly. A ghost of a bygone era with different rackets, different strings, and a different schedule. You could win Grand Slams. You could hold the #1 ranking for years. But you could not touch the ghost of 1984. The physical toll of the modern game made it mathematically impossible. That was the consensus. But Jannik Sinner is not just ignoring that consensus. He is quietly dismantling it, match by match, set by set. He is approaching the ceiling. And he is doing it without a single drop of excess emotion. To understand the magnitude of what is happening, you have to look at the players standing on the other side of the net. You have to look at the ATP locker room, a place defined by towering egos and hyper-competitive belief systems. At the elite level of professional tennis, no one steps onto the court believing they are already beaten. Everyone studies the tape. Everyone employs data analysts to find a technical flaw, a drop in serving speed, or a vulnerability in lateral movement. Now look at Casper Ruud. He is a player who has built his entire career on geometric precision and heavy topspin. On dirt courts, he understands angles and court positioning better than almost anyone else currently holding a racket. Yet, during that final in Rome, if you watch his body language in the second set, you witness a disturbing reality. Ruud was not being overpowered in the traditional, violent sense of the word. He was not being blasted off the court by unreturnable 130-mile-per-hour baseline rockets. Instead, he was being systematically dismantled. When you observe the press conferences of players after they face Jannik Sinner right now, there is a distinct lack of tactical excuses. Because we strictly adhere to the reality of the post-match tape, we cannot invent a dramatic quote from Ruud throwing his hands up in despair. But what is present in his demeanor, and in the collective reaction of the tour, is a chilling resignation. They do not point to a specific shot they missed. They acknowledge a total lack of oxygen. The court feels incredibly small, and time feels incredibly compressed. That is not bad luck. That is structural suffocation. Sinner's baseline game operates like an industrial press. It does not speed up when he is excited, and crucially, it does not slow down when he is nervous. The revolutions per minute on his forehand, the depth of his backhand, they remain terrifyingly constant regardless of the scoreline. He hits the ball with the exact same ruthless, mechanical cadence at 40-0 as he does when facing a break point in the second set of a Masters final. He is entirely removing human emotion from the equation of his match management. This brings us back to the psychological difference between this current run and the historical precedents from the United States. When you study the archives of John McEnroe dominating the tour in 1984, you see a man constantly riding the razor's edge of an emotional breakdown. McEnroe's brilliance was inextricably linked to his volatility. He needed the friction. He required the argument with the umpire, the roar of the hostile crowd, and the internal chaos to fuel his genius. He won 82 matches by weaponizing his own instability. Jannik Sinner requires absolutely no friction. He operates in a vacuum. And that is exactly why the 1,984 ceiling is suddenly looking so vulnerable. That historical ceiling was built on the fundamental assumption that an athlete cannot sustain physical and emotional perfection for 11 months. The emotional crashes, the mental fatigue, the bad days at the office, those are what cause the losses. But what happens if the player simply refuses to engage with the emotion? What happens if the player treats a championship point in Italy the exact same way he treats a Tuesday afternoon practice drill? The ceiling stops acting as a protective barrier for the history books, and it starts looking like an inevitable target. Now, to fully grasp the gravity of this impending collapse, we have to look away from the players currently getting suffocated on the court and listen to the people who study the architecture of the sport. When you are inside the storm, everything just looks like rain. To understand the scale of the weather system, you need someone looking at the radar. Patrick Mouratoglou, a man whose entire career is built on identifying, developing, and analyzing generational talent, recently looked at the mathematical reality of this specific era. Speaking about the historical context of what we are witnessing right now, Mouratoglou laid out the numbers plainly, without any romanticism for the past. The percentage of matches won by John McEnroe in 1984 is unbelievable, Mouratoglou stated. I think this record is beatable. When you see the dominance of Carlos and Jannik at the moment, I think they can beat that record. I think this record is beatable. For 40 years, that sentence was considered absolute tennis blasphemy. But Mouratoglou is not dealing in nostalgia, and he is not trying to generate cheap controversy. He is looking at the raw, underlying data of the current tour. That is not just a passing compliment to the new generation. That is a structural recalculation of what is physically and mathematically possible in men's tennis. Here is where the story actually turns terrifying. And this is the secret revelation sitting underneath Sinner's current run. The reason he is threatening the 1,984 ceiling is not because he is playing a higher peak of tennis than McEnroe did. The secret is that Sinner has virtually eliminated the very concept of a bad day. They get emotional. Their first serve percentage drops under pressure. They rush their forehand because they are frustrated by the wind, the crowd, or a bad call. But when you pull the data on Jannik Sinner's 2026 clay campaign, culminating in that Rome final, the pattern is staggering. His first serve points won does not fluctuate based on the gravity of the moment. If you track his unforced errors during the deepest, most physically demanding rallies against a grinder like Casper Ruud, you do not see the standard spike in fatigue-induced mistakes. The data pattern is completely flat. It is horizontal. While his opponent's lungs are burning and their decision-making is compromised by exhaustion and anxiety, Sinner continues to operate at the exact same tactical frequency, facing a break point at 4 to 4 inches the second set. His internal rhythm remains identical to the opening point of the match. He does not redline. He does not summon miraculous, low-percentage shots to save himself. He just executes the baseline algorithm. When you compare the biomechanics and the emotional output of these two eras, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The United States in the 1980s produced a brand of tennis that was highly individualistic, highly volatile, and heavily dependent on momentum. McEnroe's 1984 was a fire that burned so hot it scorched everything in its path. He won those 82 matches by riding a wave of aggressive adrenaline. Jannik Sinner's 2026 is a glacier. It moves slowly, it makes absolutely no noise, and it crushes absolutely everything in its way. The statistical ghost of 1984 was always protected by the assumption of human frailty. It was protected by the universal belief that eventually, over a long enough 11-month timeline, every player will crack under the pressure, get angry, or simply wake up feeling physically off. But what we are seeing from the man from Italy is a complete bypass of the emotional spectrum. The 1984 ceiling is not going to be shattered by an emotional genius having the season of a lifetime. It is going to be I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. It is very easy to get swept up in the clinical perfection of a 6-4 victory in a Masters final, and prematurely declare that the history books are already rewritten. The generous reading of this current era is that Jannik Sinner has simply evolved past the rest of the tour, that he has cracked the code of modern tennis and built an unbeatable baseline framework. The less generous reading, however, is that maintaining this level of algorithmic perfection requires a physical toll that the human body is quite literally not designed to handle. Both readings might be true at once. When a traditional tennis player gets angry, when they yell at their coaching box, or argue a line call, it is not just a loss of focus. Biomechanically and psychologically, it acts as a release valve. It bleeds off the internal pressure. The tension leaves the shoulders, and the body resets. But because Jannik Sinner does not utilize a visible emotional release valve, he absorbs the intense friction of a high-stakes match entirely internally. Every ounce of pressure from the crowd in Italy, every heavy, grinding rally against Casper Ruud, is swallowed and processed silently by his joints, his tendons, and his central nervous system. That is not just focus. That is a massive internal tax. If you look at the historical data of the ATP Tour, the players who attempt to operate with zero emotional variance, who play like machines, eventually face abrupt physical consequences. We have seen Sinner struggle with his physical durability in the earlier stages of his career, the hip issues, the physical compromises during grueling five-setters. His tennis mind is clearly ready to challenge John McEnroe's 82-3 record. But the question that sits underneath all of this is whether his physical architecture can withstand the sheer volume of matches required to get there. There is a completely valid version of this story, where Sinner does not lose his tactical form, but his body simply says no. It is not just an emotional barrier. It is a physical meat grinder. The modern ATP schedule, stretching from the hard courts of the United States to the heavy, grueling dirt of Europe, is specifically designed to break athletes down. To catch this statistical ghost, you have to play deep into the weekend, every single week, for 11 months. Sinner is currently suppressing the emotional fatigue brilliantly, but you cannot outthink physical exhaustion. The ceiling is right there, hovering just above him, but the closer he gets to it, the heavier the physical burden becomes. My prediction is this, and I am going to commit to it. Jannik Sinner will continue to operate this baseline algorithm. He will push closer to the 8-2 win mark than anyone in the modern era has ever dared to dream. I believe the 1984 record will eventually fall, but the cost will be massive. The structural tax of absorbing that much internal pressure, without an emotional release valve, is going to force a physical reckoning before this season is over. The courts will be the judge. But this situation does not exist in a vacuum, because if Sinner has successfully redefined the mathematical ceiling of what is possible on a tennis court, the pressure immediately shifts to the rest of the elite tier, and specifically, to Carlos Alcaraz. The man from Spain is now staring at a rival who does not blink, who does not complain, and who does not offer free points on a bad day. Alcaraz has built his brilliance on spectacular shot-making and overwhelming emotional surges. But how do you use emotion to melt a glacier? If Sinner is setting a new, terrifying standard for relentless perfection, Alcaraz is going to have to structurally upgrade his own game, or risk being suffocated by this new era. The ghost of 1984 is awake, and the entire tour now has to respond. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Will Jannik Sinner break John McEnroe's 1,984 win rate with this algorithmic perfection, or will his own body stop him first? Come back to this video when the tour reaches the late stages of the season in the United States, because everything we have discussed today will either look prescient or look like overcautious noise. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The most interesting takes always end up at the top, so get in there. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.